The study that we decided to replicate was called Effects of Technology Breaks on Media Multitasking with College Students. We all identified phone use as a behavior that we engaged in while studying. Media multitasking can be defined as looking at, reading, playing with, texting, or touching a personal digital device while engaged in another task such as studying or working. This does not include speaking or using the device while not engaged in another academic task. The original study included 2 female undergraduate students between the ages of 18 to 25 and used a multiple baseline across participants' design. The participants were told their studying was being researched, however, were not told the purpose of the study until afterwards. The study researched both experimenter-implemented breaks and self-implemented breaks, and the participants were instructed to feel free to use technology as they desired. The breaks were 1 minute in duration, and the frequency and duration of phone use outside of the scheduled breaks was tracked. A similar study was done in 2015 called Remind Me, Reducing Negative Effects of Multitasking. In this study, groups of students were split into 2 groups where one group would receive a reminder on their computer after being off task for 1 minute, and one group was able to be off task without reminders to study. This study concluded that the females that received reminders performed significantly better on a post-test than the females that did not receive a reminder. A study earlier this year discusses the inattention that is seen in undergraduate students when using smartphones. It is called fear of missing out, FOMO, among undergraduate students in relation to attention, distraction, and learning disengagement in lectures. A questionnaire was given to 2,084 undergraduate students to determine their feelings about cell phone use in classroom settings, disengagement, and missing out on social media posts. The study centers around the idea that the motivation behind students' cell phone use in classrooms is a fear of missing out, the feeling that they have to constantly check social media and the internet or they will miss out on something important. It cites other studies that demonstrate a connection between cell phone use and lack of attention and deficits in information retention. This inattention affects learning negatively. It makes an interesting point of stating that multitasking can be productive if it is being used to supplement classroom activities like taking notes. However, in a study titled Internet and Cell Phone Usage Patterns Among Young Adults with Intellectual Disabilities that used a questionnaire on internet and cell phone usage patterns in one-on-one interviews of 216 youth with intellectual disabilities. It found that young people with disabilities make more social and recreational use of their phones and the internet rather than the educational use. The purpose of our study was to examine the use of personal technology devices while engaged in studying behavior. Specifically, the study was concerned with media multitasking and the use of technology breaks while engaged in independent academic tasks.
For the methods part of our project, I talked about the participants and the setting. Our participants were 5 female graduate students, ages 25 to 48. We are all enrolled in the same online class at Ball State University. Recruiting our team members was based on our time zone. This ensured that we would be able to meet weekly without any time discrepancies. Each participant received grades based on the data that they turned in and the reviews by the other group members. This study took place in each participant's home in their usual study spot. Each participant was aware of the purpose of the study. No one was excluded from the study, as each participant had high levels of media multitasking in their baseline measures. Section 2.2 of methods are response definitions and measurements. Media multitasking was defined as looking at, reading, playing with, texting, or touching a personal digital device while engaged in another task, such as studying or working, for more than 5 seconds. This did not include speaking or using the device while not engaged in another academic task. On-task behavior was defined as being engaged with study materials for more than 5 seconds. This includes typing papers, reading materials, or writing information. Interresponse time, duration, and frequency of media multitasking was recorded for each participant. Section 2.3 of methods, Inter-Observer Agreement, or IOA. We calculated 30% of our sessions for each phase of the study for all 5 of us. For media multitasking, IOA was calculated for the duration per occurrences. So we divided the shorter recorded duration by the longer recorded duration for each occurrence. And then we added these values together and divided by the total number of occurrences and then multiplied by 100 to give us a percentage. Each member of the group had a partner to send data to and calculate IOA. I had 100% IOA. Nicole had an overall IOA of 98%. Brittany C. had a 96% IOA. Meredith had Meredith had 99% IOA, and Kristen had 100% IOA. In the last section of the methods that I did was our experimental design. We used a multiple baseline across participants design to evaluate the effects of technology breaks on our media multitasking. This design was used because of its flexibility and the possibility that the intervention would have irreversible effects.
First thing I'm going to discuss is our baseline data. Each baseline session was 1 hour long. Each person had free access to study materials during baseline. That could include books, pencils, highlighters, anything else that you would need to study. And they had free access to their phones. The participant was free to use their phone at any time during baseline with no consequences regardless of frequency or duration. Each session was recorded and timed by the participant and conducted in a study space that was their typical place to study. Baseline sessions were recorded until stability of data was achieved. Data on frequency, duration, and inter-response time were then collected by the participant on their own videos. 30% of the videos recorded for baseline and intervention were then sent to another member of the group to collect data on frequency, duration, IRT, and IOA. After that, the participant implemented their own technology breaks during each session. And what that entailed was, before beginning the first phase of intervention, the average IRT time for all baseline sessions by each participant was calculated. That was done by adding all of the IRT times and then dividing by the total number of sessions. Study times were then set at just slightly below the average IRT time. After establishing that IRT, each participant moved on to implementing their technology breaks during their sessions. Timers were set for session length of 60 minutes and study length at the beginning of each session, the study length being the average IRT, or just slightly below the average IRT. When the timers ended for the study time, 1 minute was added to the timer and the participant was allowed to be on their phone until the timer went off. This was their technology break. After 2 sessions with 1 or less instances of phone usage outside of the technology break, 2 minutes were added to the study time. The procedural integrity part of the study, during data collection for IOA, when the video was sent to another member of the group, procedural integrity was evaluated by that member as well. This involved watching the video and checking to make sure that timers were used correctly, with the timers being set for 60 minutes. the study time being shown on the timer as well. The participant would hold up their timer to the camera to make sure that the timer was correct. They'd also be checking for that all study materials were present and that the phone was available throughout the session.
I'm Nicole, and I will be discussing my data from the study. During baseline sessions, my average work time was 7.4 minutes, meaning on average I was getting on my phone every 7.4 minutes. So I began phase 1 with a work timer set for 7 minutes, just under that average. The gray squares on the graph represent the frequency of me checking my phone. During baseline, my frequency was on a downward trend. The white bars are showing the duration of time I spent on my phone outside of breaks, and the black bars are representing the duration of time I spent on my phone during the implemented breaks. My total duration of time on my phone outside of the implemented breaks started at 4.5 minutes in phase 1, however, was on a downward trend. My frequency in phase 1 started at 6 times, however, was also on a downward trend to 2, then 1, and then 0. After having 1 or fewer occurrences on my phone, I was able to move to the next phase, which would increase my work timer by 2 minutes. Both phase 2 with a 9-minute work timer and phase 3 an 11-minute work timer had stable data with having 1 or fewer instances of me being on my phone. My average time spent on my phone went from 7.4 minutes in baseline to 0 minutes outside of breaks in my third phase.
During baseline, the average length of duration I was on my phone was 17.5 minutes, and the average frequency was 5.7 with a range of 5 to 7. The average IRT during baseline was 6.1. My baseline phase shows moderately high levels of duration with high variability. Baseline levels of frequency show a low level with some variability with a slight decreasing trend. Phase 1, my scheduled study time was 6 minutes before I was able to engage in a 1-minute multimedia break. During Phase 1, the average duration of multimedia use outside of multimedia breaks was 0.4 minutes, and the average frequency was 1 with a range of 0 to 2. My Phase 1 data shows a low level and stable trend, with frequency also being at a low level with stability decreasing to 0. The low level and decreasing trend continued from Phase 1 into Phase 2 in regard to duration and frequency. In Phase 2, the 6-minute study time was increased to 8 minutes. During this phase, my average duration of multimedia use outside of multimedia breaks was 0.08 minutes, and the average frequency was 0. In Phase 3, the 8-minute study time was increased to 10 minutes. The average duration of multimedia use outside of multimedia breaks during this phase was 0 minutes, and average frequency was also 0. Phase 3 also showed my data occurring at the 0 level.
Hi, my name is Kristen Lassley, and I'm going to talk to you today about my data for our replication project involving media multitasking. When looking at my graph for this project, the first thing that jumps out and is very apparent is the difference between my baseline and intervention phases. I have very short duration and frequency during the baseline, with nothing higher than 1 minute 15 seconds, and only 5 total instances of media multitasking or using my phone outside of breaks. Once intervention was implemented, the duration increased dramatically, with a range of 3 to 5 minutes for all 3 phases. However, outside of the technology breaks, I only had 1 short instance of using my phone in the first intervention and none throughout the rest of the intervention phases. During intervention, there was a descending trend in my duration. However, the shortest duration I had during intervention was 3 minutes, which was 1 minute and 45 seconds longer than my longest time in baseline. One more phase of intervention probably would have taken my duration down to 2 minutes, but with the stability of the data and the descending trend, it was unnecessary to keep recording sessions and collecting data. The descending trend indicates that the intervention was effective and that it was working. However, the differences in my baseline and intervention indicate that I was not in need of the intervention, as those 2 factors, the duration and frequency, were already at a low level. The intervention itself was responsible for the increase in my duration data. So that shows that I was not in need of the intervention as it was designed. So my level of media multitasking is not in need of change and is unlikely to negatively affect my study habits.
Hi, my name is Brittany Rance, and I'm going to be talking about our behavior change project. So for our behavior change project, we chose to see how scheduled technology breaks would impact our media usage while we are studying. We chose this intervention because it was all super relevant to our lives. We all have to study for school, and we all find it hard to stay on task when we should be studying. We all live very active lives, and using social media and our phones just kind of seems to be a constant. I know that when I hear my phone ding or I hear an email come in, I instantly want to check those things and not wait until I'm done studying. So to start our intervention, we took baseline data on how often we accessed our phones in a 60-minute study session. I studied mostly in my living room, reading my Cooper book. I had pretty stable baseline data. The first baseline data, I accessed my phone 6 times for about 13 minutes. My second baseline data, I accessed my phone 6 times and for about 14 minutes. My third baseline data point, I accessed my phone 6 times and for about 7 minutes. So it's pretty stable baseline. And from there, I calculated my IRT. I found my IRT in a response time by figuring out how long I was on task between each instance of phone usage. So my IRT for the first intervention phase was 7 minutes and 15 seconds. This gave me 6 technology breaks for 1 minute each, adding up to 6 minutes during a 60-minute study session. As I started my intervention, I had trouble only accessing my phone during my scheduled technology breaks. I accessed my phone 2 times for a total of 4 minutes. And although it was lower than my baseline, I needed to only access my phone 1 time or less outside of the breaks to be able to move on to the next phase of intervention. So my second, third, and fourth data points for intervention 1 proved to be more successful. I only accessed my phone 1 or 0 times. I was then able to move on to the second phase of intervention. Once we moved on to phase 2, it added 2 more minutes to my study time. So then I was studying for 9 minutes and 15 seconds before accessing a 1-minute technology break. This gave me 5 technology breaks in a 60-minute study session. I was successful. I did not access my phone at all outside of the breaks for the second phase of intervention. So then I moved on to the third phase, which added another 2 minutes to my IRT for 11 minutes and 15 seconds. And this gave me 4 scheduled technology breaks. I again did not access my phone at all outside of the technology breaks and had very stable data and ended our intervention there. I found that this intervention did help me in studying as I knew that I had a break coming up. So if I heard my phone ding or if I wanted to check a message, I would just wait because I knew that I had a 1-minute break coming up and I would be able to look at it then. So these technology breaks did help me stay on task, and I would recommend them for anyone that struggles staying on task during studying.
I had the most variable data for all of our participants. My baseline had to extend to 6 sessions, which was very different from the other participants, which either had 3 or 4 sessions in their baseline. My duration varied between 5.5 minutes to 15 minutes in my baseline, and the average duration was about 11.5 minutes. My frequency averaged about 7 occurrences, ranging between 4 and 11 during the baseline. As you can see in my graph, it's very up and down and all over the place. But during my phase 1, I only engaged with media for the first session. And I did so 3 times for 2 minutes, which really kind of skewed my data for the means for the frequency and the duration during phase 1, because my mean was about 15 seconds for duration. My range was 0 to 2 minutes for duration, and my frequency was 0 to 3 occurrences, which made my mean for phase 1 for frequency 0.7. And then after this first session in the first phase, there were no more occurrences of engaging with media. I had 0 levels in all of phase 2 and phase 3. I'm going to go over the results of our study across all participants. During baseline, we had some variable data. The average amount of time each of us spent while engaged with our phone or media was 10.5 minutes, but we had a range from 1.5 minutes all the way to 22.5 minutes, which is a fairly large range, and our observation period is only 60 minutes. So to spend 1/3 of that on your phone, that's not an effective use of study time. And our average of times engaged with our phone was 5, and the range was between 1 and 11 times. We had 2 participants, which kind of skewed our data for our averages, and they were Kristen and Meredith. Kristen only engaged in about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes of being on her phone during baseline, while Meredith on average spent about 17.5 minutes on her phone during baseline. And during our first phase of the intervention, the average for all participants was less than a minute, which means our intervention was fairly effective in the very first phase. Our range for duration during phase 1 was from 0 to 4.5 minutes. And the frequency averaged about 1 time, but our range was 0 times being on your phone all the way up to 6 times being on your phone or engaged with media. But by phase 2, all participants either engaged with their phone or media only 1 time or 0 times. And by phase 3, none of the participants engaged in media use or phone use outside of their multimedia breaks. So our results show that this intervention quickly and consistently changed the behavior for all of the participants. Myself and fellow group members discussed that because we knew we were going to get a break to spend some time on our phone or check that alert, that it decreased our motivation to just immediately respond to that alert. And that brings us to my first limitation I want to talk about of our study. All of us are a little bit older since we're in grad school, and our brains have developed to where we have some better impulse control, self-control. So I'm not sure that this would be quite as effective for younger participants or clients due to the decreased ability to control some of their own behavior, especially with the current climate that we have with the constant need to be on social media, which is usually accessed via our phones. And another thing that might really affect how effective that this intervention is that we are in grad school, and so we have monetarily invested in this opportunity of education. Younger students that are in middle school, high school, or even maybe undergrad might not be as invested. So their motivation to stay off of their phone while they're supposed to be studying or stay off of their laptop would be a little bit less.
Another limitation to the study could be that each participant used a different method to time breaks and work time. Kitchen timers, phones, iPads, and watches were all used to implement the intervention. This could affect how quickly the participants were able to respond to their timer and switch between timing their work and timing their break. If a participant is only using their phone to track time, they may end up spending more time on their phone than planned. When your work timer ends, the participant would have to go onto their phone, end that timer, change the time to their break time, which in this study was 1 minute, and then start that time. By then, they've already been on their phone longer than the scheduled 1 minute break. When the participant's 1 minute timer ends, they then have to go back into the timer app, change the time back to their work time, and then start it again. This process prolongs the amount of time the participant is on their phone, which would defeat the purpose of the study. While we weren't tracking this particular process in our replication, some might because the original study didn't discuss this limitation. The experimenters in the original study provided timers for their participants, so this wasn't an issue in their study. However, if you're replicating the study, you may not have access to an abundance of timers, so you would resort to using other methods like explained above. In future replications, a point should be made to make all timing devices the same across participants so that there is consistency. One recommendation is to have 2 separate kitchen timers, one for work time and one for break time. When the work timer ends, the participant can stop it and not clear it, and then they can immediately start their break time. When the break time ends, they can do the same, stop the timer but not clear it, and immediately start the work time. This method would eliminate any unnecessary time that is used to change the time between each timer.
The greatest limitation to our study was that the participants were aware of what was being measured. This bias could have greatly impacted the results due to the participants knowing their phone use was being monitored. This could have resulted in the participants either being on their phone less since the study was being used to reduce phone use during study. It also could have meant that the participants were getting on their phone more, so there would be more data to track during the study. Another limitation or barrier to our study was that we were unable to replicate the experimenter-implemented breaks. In the original study, they also utilized experimenter-implemented breaks where the experimenter would stop and start the timers for the participant. This would allow for the participant to be better focused on studying and more closely resemble their usual study time rather than also having to be in charge of the work and break timers as we did in the self-implemented break model. In future studies, experimenter-implemented breaks should be utilized and faded to a self-implemented break system to help generalize results after the completion of the study.
The final limitation of our study was that there was no consequence procedure set up for when occurrences of engagement with media occurred outside of our breaks. I think that this would be an important factor when using this intervention for other participants, especially when maybe working in a more one-on-one setting or with students who have teachers' aides. So then that they can implement some sort of consequence. But overall, as a participant implemented multimedia breaks, I found this to be very effective. I got off my phone pretty immediately during this intervention, and the other participants did as well.